Thank you for that reading. Familiar story. That's a story we tell our kids often in children's church, and sometimes it kind of gets reduced to a cartoonish kid's story, but I think there's a whole lot more to be had in this story and so many others. He was trying to see Jesus. That's what I've entitled this talk today. What a loaded statement. I've spent my whole life trying to see Jesus, and there's so many different images of Jesus. When you talk about us, like we say that we're a Jesus-centered church, I've had people say, well, which Jesus are you talking about? Because there are very many characterizations of Jesus throughout the church. And you would think that this person that we claim to follow, we would have a more clear or concise view of who he is than the church seems to have, but sometimes there's some confusion. I'm going to begin with a confession today. I lived most of my adult life as a Christian trying to avoid seeing Jesus. What do you mean by that? Well, I was a worship leader in church. I sang songs of praise and worship to Jesus. I taught adults and children about Jesus, but I was actually in leadership in several of these churches. But when it came right down to it, I spent many years really trying to avoid seeing the totality of Jesus that I think we can find in Scriptures. Not that we can find all of who Jesus is in the Scriptures at all, but at least we have a characterization of him that's available to us that I tried for many years to avoid seeing. I knew quite a bit about the Bible, but I was actually deficient in seeing Jesus. And the reason of that was the case was I allowed a lot of other biblical voices to crowd out the voice of Jesus. I celebrated David and Joshua and Moses and lots of other biblical characters, but really needed to see more of who Jesus was. I actually dismissed many of Jesus' sayings and teachings. Things like, don't overcome evil with evil, but overcome evil with good. I just thought that just doesn't work. It might have been a nice saying for Jesus to say 2,000 years ago. Turn the other cheek. I said that's just not practical. That won't work in our world today. Love your enemies. That's impossible. Maybe in the millennium I can love my enemies when they're all fixed, and maybe when I'm fixed. Here's a tough one. If you love me, keep my commandments. I sang, I love you, Lord, over and over and over again. But if I was honest with myself, I wasn't keeping his commandments. There was a meme this week, I think the Babylon Bee put out about a worship leader, youth worship pastor who'd been singing, I Could Sing of Your Love Forever since 1999. And it's just to illustrate that we can sing songs of praise to God, to Jesus, but really not be living a life that obeys his commandments. And John wrote in that those who say, I love God, and hate their brothers or sisters are liars. Wouldn't that be a convenient one to strike from the text, huh? For those who do not love a brother or sister whom they have seen cannot love God, whom they have not seen. So I had this huge animosity in my heart toward many other people, especially those who were of a different persuasion than I, maybe political particularly. Take the log out of your own eye first. That's a tough one to follow through on. There was a pervasive, though unspoken idea in the Christian circles that I was in that said, if you are saved, you don't really need to obey Jesus. Full obedience will come in the millennium or after we die. Now, nobody actually spoke that, but that's how we all lived. We felt like if we had made this decision, if we'd said the magic prayer and we'd said the right words, that put us in right standing with God, and that was the most important thing. That as long as that was done, then basically we could live how we wanted to live. Yeah, we should ask for forgiveness if we did something egregious and hurt someone. But I really discovered that over the years I was avoiding seeing Jesus because I didn't really want to see the Jesus that I read of in many places in the Scripture. This Zacchaeus story has helped me kind of understand what I was doing. It's a familiar story. The lectionary places it right after the parable we looked at last week of the Pharisee and the tax collector. So Jesus told a parable, so this was not a real event that we talked about last week, where a Pharisee and a tax collector both go up to the temple to pray. We discussed that there was a prescribed times when you would go to the temple to pray. You didn't just go to the temple and pray, off the cuff. There were particular times, and the prayer only came after the sacrifice for atonement was offered. So the priest would offer the sacrifice of atonement, then the sacrifice would be burned on the altar, and then there would be incense lit. At that point, atonement had been made for people's sins, and that was the point where it was appropriate in Jewish thought to pray. And of course, you're familiar with that story. The Pharisee prays, "I thank God that I'm not like these other people." He's speaking this apart from the crowd, but loud enough so they could hear him. And he picks out this tax collector who was standing on the other side of the room. "I'm glad I'm not like that. Thank you, God, that I'm not like him. I do a couple of things. I tithe on all of my income, and what was the other thing he does? Let me help me. Tithes on fast twice a week, yeah. So, and we discussed that both of those things were not required by the Scriptures. They were extra, they went above and beyond what the Scriptures required of him. So let's keep that story in mind, because I think there are some interesting parallels and contrasts between these two stories as we look at the Zacchaeus story this morning. Starting at verse 1 and 2, Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through it. A man was there named Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was rich. So tax collectors, we've discussed, became rich by extorting money, basically saying, you owe the Romans a certain amount of tax. Often they didn't owe the Romans that amount of tax, but the tax collectors would inflate the amount that they collected from people in order to enrich themselves. So they were pretty much despised. So this was not just any tax collector, it was a rich tax collector, somebody who had done this to a significant level. He'd defrauded his own people a significant amount of money. So he would have been despised by his fellow Jews. He was trying to see who Jesus was. Oh, you could just camp on that phrase. He was trying to see who Jesus was, but on account of the crowd, he could not, because he was short in stature. So he ran ahead, climbed a sycamore tree to see him, because he was going to pass that way. So by this time, the reputation of Jesus had spread throughout Galilee and Judea. This is Jesus on his way back to Jerusalem to be crucified. So he was a fairly well-known character at this point through this region. Zacchaeus, I think, had surely heard of Jesus. Perhaps he'd caught a glimpse of him somewhere else. Perhaps he'd heard about Jesus healing lepers or delivering demon-possessed people. Perhaps he'd heard of some of Jesus' teachings or parables. Whatever the case, he was now trying to see this Jesus that he'd heard of. So he leaves the crowd and he climbs up into this tree. This makes me ask, why was I avoiding seeing Jesus for so much of my life? And I think this tells me it was easier to stay in the crowd. It's always easier to stay in the crowd than to depart from the crowd in order to see Jesus. It's easier to catch glimpses of Jesus through the crowd. With all the people in the sanctuary, you can catch a glimpse of Jesus here and there. The crowd was worshiping Jesus, but mostly not obeying Jesus. And we've talked about this a little bit. In Jewish thought, to worship God meant to obey God. It was not a song service. It was not praise and worship like we call it today. I mean, you can do praise and worship and not obey God at all. And that's really a misnomer to think that the singing that we do in church is a form of worship. It's not even a form of worship. Jews thought of worship as being obedient to God. That's why when it says they go to the temple to worship, they weren't going to have to a praise and worship service. They were going to obey the statutes of the law, to bring the required sacrifice, to have their sins atoned for, and that was considered worship. So I think we very much minimize worship when we think that it's just singing songs. I mean, we should sing songs. Paul tells us to sing hymns and praise songs and worship to God, but we shouldn't mistake that for worship, for being obedient to God. So those glimpses, though, that I started to catch through the crowd eventually caused me to step out of the crowd. Those glimpses of the blinding beauty of Jesus were enough to get me to climb up to a higher vantage point. And many of you people have done the same thing here. Zacchaeus here in this story makes a concerted effort to get out of the crowd and get to a vantage point where he can see Jesus. He makes an effort. I did the same thing. I finally came to the point where I decided to make a concerted effort to see this man Jesus, to listen to Jesus, and to follow Jesus. Because I thought that's what his stories were calling me to do. So Zacchaeus made this concerted effort to get above the crowd in order so that he could see Jesus. Getting above the crowd can happen in at least 3 ways that I've thought of. Here's one way you can get above the crowd. Give the crowd what they want. If you give the crowd what they want and you're good at it, the crowd will lift you up. All kinds of people do this. Musicians do this, politicians do this, athletes do this. Our culture does this. Our culture creates an environment where we're encouraged to lift up above our peers those that are better at something that they do. It's what the crowd tried to do with Jesus, but he wouldn't allow them to do that. They tried to make him their king, but he would not allow them to lift him above the crowd in that way. And this leaves us to the second way of getting above the crowd. This is the way Jesus got above the crowd, on a cross. When he refused to be the kind of Messiah the people wanted, the kind of Messiah that they would raise up in adulation, he became perceived as a threat both to the political and the religious establishments, and he was placed above the crowd, but not certainly like a rock star is. Not a lifting up in adoration, but a lifting up out of fear and misunderstanding. But Jesus foresaw this. Remember, he said, "If I be lifted up, I will draw all people to myself." So this was a tragic, but also a wonderful lifting up, because it's through this lifting up that the crowd was completely mistaken about, that Jesus says he will draw all people to himself in. All people. Not some people, not a subset of people, not a handful of the elect, but all people. So you can get above the crowd by giving the crowd what they want, like a rock star, or by not giving the crowd what they want, like Jesus. But this is not what Zacchaeus was doing. He was despised by the crowd, kind of similar to Jesus, but for a different reason. Maybe that's why he was trying to see who Jesus was, because his peers despised him. We don't know exactly why, but Zacchaeus was trying to see Jesus. He makes an effort to get above the crowd. The crowd didn't lift Zacchaeus up in the tree in admiration. They might have liked to kill Zacchaeus, but he was likely protected by the Roman authorities because he was their tax collector. So Zacchaeus takes deliberate steps to remove himself from the crowd in order to see Jesus. I think we have to do that sometimes in this culture today. He's not looking for the crowd's admiration. He's just trying to see Jesus. He wasn't content to just hear what the crowd said about Jesus, because they had lots of opinions. He wasn't content just to catch a fleeting glimpse of Jesus, but in climbing up that tree, it didn't just give him a different vantage point from which to see Jesus, it also exposed him to the crowd that despised him. He took a risk, in other words, in trying to see Jesus. He set himself apart from the crowd, which meant that he could no longer hide in the crowd, and it meant that he began to see Jesus differently than the crowd saw Jesus. I think today more and more people who have been content with going along with the Americanized, westernized view of Jesus are daring to climb an uncomfortable tree and even to go out on a limb sometimes in an effort to really see Jesus. So Jesus then sees Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus took this vantage point in order to see Jesus, and then we see that Jesus sees him. When Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today." So he hurried down and was happy to welcome him. So Jesus not only sees Zacchaeus, but he invites himself over for dinner. Zacchaeus is excited about this. I know this feeling. When I started to really see Jesus, apart from the very limited view that I had been looking at him through before, it was an exciting time. Exhilarating, a little bit nerve-wracking, a little bit apprehensive, like you can imagine Zacchaeus must have been. I started to see between the fearful fundamentalisms that I'd been raised with, and I started to see around some of the simplistic revival kind of thinking I'd completely worn myself out on. Getting apart from the crowd helped me to see a more holistic and a more historic perspective of Jesus. It exposed me to a rich depth of thought that the crowd didn't have ears to hear. It was like being lifted up in an airplane, and like in an airplane, the world looks so much different at altitude. I couldn't get enough. It was as if I could begin to see more and more of Jesus than I ever could see before. Of course, when you leave the crowd, though, there is a downside. And we see it in the next verse. All who saw it, saw that Jesus went over to Zacchaeus' house, began to grumble and said, "He is gone to be the guest of one who is a sinner." So Zacchaeus is just trying to see Jesus. He leaves the crowd. Jesus sees him. He invites himself over to his house. And what does the crowd do when they see this? They grumble. But notice the crowd just doesn't grumble against Zacchaeus, saying, "Hey, that guy's a sinner." They also begin to grumble against Jesus. Jesus, has gone to be the guest of one who is a sinner. This is spot on. When I decided to seek out Jesus in a more deliberate way, people criticized me, that's true, but they also discounted Jesus in their criticism of me. They wouldn't say it that way, but that's what happened. The clear teachings of Jesus that I finally was coming to grips with were rejected by the crowd. And I think this always happens. It's difficult to accept those clear teachings of Jesus. So, what does Zacchaeus do when he hears the crowd's criticism? When he hears the crowd grumbling, saying, calling him a sinner and being disappointed in Jesus for meeting with him, Zacchaeus does something in response. He stood there and said to the Lord, "Look, half of my possessions, Lord, I will give to the poor, and if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I will pay back 4 times as much." So Zacchaeus begins, in response to this grumbling, he begins telling Jesus what he's going to do. Half of his possessions he'll give to the poor, pay back defrauded people 4 times. So at this point, we might say that Zacchaeus really is starting to get what Jesus is all about. Because Jesus often talks about caring for the poor and helping those that are downtrodden and those are cast out, doesn't he? But if we say that in this statement here, Zacchaeus is starting to really perceive what Jesus is about and act out of that perception. If we say this, we have a problem with last week's parable, the Pharisee and the tax collector. Remember what the Pharisee said in the temple within the earshot of all the people around? "I fast twice a week and I give 1/10 of my income." Both of which were more than the law required. And here, Zacchaeus, a tax collector, within earshot of the crowd, says almost the same thing. "Look, I'm a good guy. I'm not what the crowd thinks I am. I give to the poor, and I'll pay back all of these people I've defrauded." And then Jesus says this, "Today salvation has come to this house, because he too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek out and to save the lost." So is Jesus saying, today salvation has come to this house because of the pledge that Zacchaeus just made? Like, did Jesus hear Zacchaeus say, "I'm going to do all of this for the poor"? And because of that confession, Jesus says, "Hey, you got it. Salvation has come to this house today." If he did, then we have to ask why Jesus didn't commend the Pharisee in the parable from last week for saying what he said. But he didn't do that. Remember, he tithed on all his income more than it was required. He fasted even more than it was required. See, the thing is, both the Pharisee in the temple and Zacchaeus in the tree have the same misguided idea about God. Both are seeking to find favor with God and the crowd according to what they do. But God doesn't require us to do anything to find favor with him. In fact, the very idea that we can do anything to get God to love and favor us more is misguided. It assumes that we can control God and that we can get good things from God because of what we do. So I don't think that what Jesus says here in verse 9 is in response to Zacchaeus' pledge. I think Jesus is simply accepting Zacchaeus because he is one of God's family. He says it there. He's the son of Abraham. Now, don't assume that when Jesus says this tax collector is a son of Abraham, that he's privileging the Jews, because Ishmael was a son of Abraham too, in which the whole Arab nation and culture has come from. In verse 10, Jesus says he came to seek out and save the lost. So here's the question. Who are lost? Who are the lost? Is it a small group of people and the rest of the people are okay? No, everybody's lost. Jesus came to save everyone. We're all lost. Pharisees, tax collectors, Jews, Gentiles, men, women, boys, girls, straight, gay, trans, we're all lost. And Jesus came to find all of us. Now here's another question. Will Jesus fail in his mission to seek and save all of these lost people? I don't believe so. I think if God and Jesus set out to seek and save the lost, that he'll be successful at finding and saving all of the lost. When all is said and done, will Jesus have failed the very mission that he came to accomplish? A lot of our theologies say yes, he'll be a failure. And actually, he'll be a very miserable failure, because only a fraction of people will actually be saved. That's what many of our theologies say. I choose to say, no, I think he'll be better at his mission than that. So this story, the Zacchaeus story, is actually a real-life drama. So this is a real story, not a parable like the one from last week. It's a real-life drama similar to the Pharisee and the tax collector. But this time, the tax collector is giving the speech that the Pharisee gave in the temple, just with some minor tweaks. Robert Farrar Capon writes this: "Do you see what the acted parable of Zacchaeus is all about? It is precisely a publican, a tax collector, making the Pharisee's speech, a loser who thinks that he has gotten over his losing behavior and become a 24-karat winner. And what does Jesus say to him? He says something straight off the wall. With no intervening explanation, Jesus announces, 'Today salvation has come to this house, since he is also a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost.'" In other words, Jesus brings Zacchaeus back down to the only ground on which he can possibly stand and receive a favorable judgment, the ground of the last, the lost, the least, the little, and the dead. But the bit about seeking and saving the lost is crystal clear. Jesus is uttering a judgment here, and he is uttering it on the only basis he will allow. He will not judge the cluttered business of our lives, because on that basis, none of us will be anything but condemned. He will judge us only as he raises us, reconciled and restored, out of the uncluttered nothingness of our death. Ooh, you won't hear that in your Baptist church this morning. So let's compare these two stories. In the Pharisee and the tax collector, two men go up to the temple, the house of God. That's what it was called, the house of God. In this story, Jesus, who is the temple, remember he says, "Destroy this temple and I will raise it in 3 days," comes to Zacchaeus' house. So we have a very stark contrast here. Two men go up to the temple, the house of God. In this one, the house of God goes to the house of Zacchaeus. In the first parable, a Pharisee looks down in judgment on a tax collector. In this one, Jesus looks up in mercy on a tax collector. In the first parable, a tax collector goes to the temple seeking salvation. In this one, Jesus goes to a tax collector's house bringing salvation. And finally, a Pharisee sees the world in categories of clean versus unclean, righteous versus unrighteous, in versus out. But Jesus sees the world as sons and daughters of Abraham, God's image bearers, all in need of being found, all in need of salvation, and all beloved of God. Capon continues and he writes this: just because Zacchaeus is standing there as a solid brass dead duck, Jesus raises him up uncondemned. Look, Zacchaeus, he says in effect, just bag it, will you? I have no use for all this chin music about your life. I'm on my way to make the death you're avoiding safe, to make it the only ticket anyone will ever need. Sit down, eat up. Let's just have a quiet dinner before I go down into silence and solve your problem. So, like we considered last week, there are really no good guys and bad guys in these stories. If we read them and try to discern good guys and bad guys, we'll miss the entire point of the stories. Religion makes good guys and bad guys out of these stories. Jesus doesn't make this distinction, though. All are lost, and all are in need of salvation. All are sick, and all are in need of a physician. None are righteous, no, not one, Paul says. But all are loved, and Jesus is out to save every one of us. So if we scapegoat any of these characters, we miss the whole point of the stories. We haven't reckoned with our own need of salvation. Salvation from what? Well, in this story, it's salvation from seeing ourselves as better than others. If we identify good guys and bad guys in this story, and certainly we side with the good guys when we do that, we don't reckon with our own need for this salvation. We're all lost people in need of being found. We're all sick people in need of being healed. None of us have anything to offer God that will make us more or less righteous in His sight. We can only fall on the mercy and grace of Jesus, the one who came to seek us and find us and save us and raise us from the dead. Whether we know it or not, this is the Jesus we're all trying to see.